The train arrived with a final, weary sigh of steam. Its iron bulk settled onto the tracks, as if it were as exhausted as the passengers it carried. For Lily, the journey had been more than just a trip. It was an escape. A long, rattling passage away from a past she was desperate to bury forever, and towards a future she prayed would be kind. The city she'd left behind was a place of gray stone and even grayer prospects, a place where she was nothing more than a pair of hands for sewing, invisible and utterly alone. But here, in the town of Cedar Ridge, the air was different. It smelled of dust and hay and something wild she couldn't quite name. A sharp, clean scent that promised new beginnings. She smoothed the wrinkles from her best dress, a simple blue calico that had been mended more times than she could count, and adjusted the worn bonnet on her head. Her entire life was packed into the single scuffed suitcase she clutched in her hand. Its lightness was a constant, bitter reminder of how little she had to her name, but its contents held every last one of her hopes. Tucked inside, next to her only other dress and her mother's old Bible, was the letter. The paper was soft from being folded and unfolded 100 times, the ink slightly smudged from her touch. It was from a man named Robert Miller, a man who had described his small homestead, his honest work, and his desire for a wife to build a life with. His words had been a lifeline thrown into a drowning sea, and she had grabbed hold with all her strength. Stepping down onto the wooden platform, her legs felt unsteady, a mix of the long ride and the sheer, crushing weight of her nervousness. The station was smaller than she'd imagined, just a simple wooden building with a slanted roof, perched on the edge of a vast, sprawling landscape of golden grass and distant, purple-hued mountains. The sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the sky in brilliant strokes of orange and pink. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen, and for a moment, just a moment, her heart soared. This was it. This was her new home. She found a spot on a weathered bench near the station house and set her suitcase down beside her. She tried to sit primly, back straight, hands folded in her lap, the perfect picture of a respectable woman. She watched the other passengers disembark, saw them greeted by smiling faces and warm embraces. A family reunited with laughter. A man clapped his friend on the back. The sounds of their happiness made the growing quiet around her feel even deeper, even more profound. She scanned the faces of the few men still lingering near the station, her eyes searching desperately for one who might match the description Robert had sent. He was supposed to be of average height with brown hair. He had promised, sworn in his letter, that he would be there to meet her, holding a bouquet of wildflowers so she would know him. But no one approached. The platform slowly, agonizingly, emptied. The sun dipped lower, and the long shadows of evening began to stretch like grasping fingers across the ground. The air grew cool, and Lily pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders. Maybe he was just late. Maybe his wagon had a broken wheel. She clung to these reasonable explanations, her faith in the plan she had so carefully constructed beginning to waver with each passing minute. She opened her suitcase and took out the letter again, reading his promises one more time, as if the words themselves could summon him. An older man with a kind, wrinkled face and a railroad cap emerged from the station house, sweeping the steps. He glanced at her a few times, his expression shifting from simple curiosity to a deep, unsettling pity. Finally, he leaned his broom against the wall and ambled over. "Excuse me, miss," he said, his voice gentle. "Are you waiting for someone?" Lily looked up, a flicker of hope flaring anew. "Yes, sir. I'm waiting for Robert Miller. He was to meet me here." The station master's face fell. He took off his cap and worried the brim in his hands. "Robert Miller," he repeated slowly, the name tasting like ash in his mouth. He sighed, a heavy sound that seemed to carry the dust of the plains. "I'm real sorry to tell you this, miss, but Robert Miller, he left Cedar Ridge 2 days ago." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. "Left?" Lily whispered, the word feeling strange and foreign on her tongue. Seen him on the stagecoach heading east? The man continued, his voice full of genuine sorrow. Wasn't alone, neither. He was with a woman from the next town over. There's been talk. His eyes wouldn't meet hers? Well, the talk is, he sent for more than one bride, and he picked the other one. The words landed like physical blows. The letter slipped from Lily's numb fingers and fluttered to the dusty planks of the platform. The beautiful sunset now seemed to mock her, its brilliant colors a cruel, heartless joke. The vast open land that had moments ago felt so full of promise now felt like a terrifying emptiness, a prison with no walls. She was abandoned. She had sold the few possessions she had, every last trinket, to buy the train ticket west. She had no money for a return journey, even if she had wanted to go back to the gray life she had escaped. She had nowhere to go and no one to turn to. She was utterly, completely alone. The station master muttered another apology and retreated back into his building, leaving her with the crushing silence. The last of the sunlight faded, and the world was plunged into a deep blue twilight. The first stars, cold and distant, began to prick the sky. Lily sat on the bench, her body rigid with shock and despair. The dreams of a home, of a partner, of a family, all of it had evaporated into the cool evening air. She was just a foolish girl who had believed a stranger's pretty words. A single hot tear escaped and traced a clean path through the travel dust on her cheek, followed by another, and then another. She bowed her head, the weight of it all too heavy to bear. In the overwhelming silence of the foreign night, with no human soul to hear her, she poured out her broken heart in a desperate, silent prayer. It wasn't a fancy prayer, just a raw, aching cry from the deepest part of her spirit. Please, God, I have nowhere to go. I'm so alone. Please help me. And then she simply sat, waiting in the dark, not knowing if her prayer would be answered, or if it had been lost in the immense starry sky above. The chill of the desert night began to seep through her thin shawl, a deep, penetrating cold that mirrored the ice settling in her heart. She was a single, solitary figure in the overwhelming darkness, a dropped stitch in the fabric of the world, with no one to pick her up. Meanwhile, the town of Cedar Ridge was settling into its nightly rhythm. Lanterns glowed in the windows of the few buildings that lined the main street. The general store, the blacksmith, the small boarding house. At the livery stable, a young man named Heath was finishing his final chores. He was a man of the land, his hands calloused from rope and reins, his face weathered by sun and wind. There was a quiet steadiness to him, a man who understood the patient rhythms of the soil and the seasons. After seeing to his horse, a strong bay gelding he called Gus, Heath walked toward the general store. He needed a new bag of nails and a few other supplies for the ranch he ran with his younger sister May. The bell above the door jingled as he entered, the warm, familiar smells of leather, coffee, and pickling spice washing over him. The storekeeper, Mr. Abernathy, was there along with a couple of other local men. As Heath collected his items, their talk turned to the day's most notable piece of news. Sad business, the blacksmith was saying, shaking his head. Saw her myself when the afternoon train came in. Sitting there on that bench, pretty as a picture in a blue dress, just waiting. Robert Miller's doing, I hear, Mr. Abernathy said, his tone disapproving. Word is he sent for a bride, then lit out with Betsy Caldwell from over in Juniper Gulch. Left that poor girl high and dry. Heath paused, a bag of nails heavy in his hand. He listened as the men clucked their tongues, their gossip a mixture of sympathy and a kind of grim fascination. They talked about the foolishness of mail-order arrangements, but none of them spoke of what was to be done. To them, the abandoned woman was a topic of conversation, a temporary tragedy that belonged to someone else. But Heath felt a different sort of feeling settle in his chest, a tight, uncomfortable knot. He was a man of deep conviction, shaped by parents who had taught him that faith without action was a hollow thing. The thought of anyone, much less a woman alone, being left stranded in the cold dark, felt fundamentally wrong. He paid for his nails in silence, the men's chatter continuing behind him. Stepping back out into the cool night, he stood on the porch of the store, looking down the dark, empty street toward the distant train station. The image the men had painted lodged in his mind. He thought of his sister May, safe at home, and what he would want for her if she were ever in such a desperate situation. The answer was simple. She would not be left to sit in the dark. He mounted Gus and turned the horse not toward home, but toward the station master's house. He found the old man smoking a pipe on his porch. "Evening, Jim." Heath tipped his hat. "Heard about the young woman at the station. Is she still there?" The station master nodded, puffing on his pipe. "Aye, Heath, she is. Won't budge. Got no money, no place to go. It's a sorry state of affairs." Heath didn't need to hear more. He thanked the man and turned Gus toward the outskirts of town. He knew this was an unusual thing he was doing, riding out at night to fetch a perfect stranger. People might talk. The woman herself might be frightened. But the feeling in his chest, that firm, unwavering sense of what was right, pushed him forward. When he finally reached the station, the scene was just as he had feared. The platform was bathed in silvery moonlight, and there she was. She looked so small and fragile on the wide bench, her shoulders hunched against the cold. Even in the dim light he could see the tracks of tears glistening on her cheeks. She looked up as he approached, her eyes wide with a fresh wave of fear. She flinched back, clutching her suitcase like a shield. Heath stopped a respectful distance away. He took off his wide-brimmed hat, holding it in front of him. He kept his voice low and soft, the way he would when approaching a skittish colt. "Evening, ma'am," he said. "My name is Heath. I live on a ranch a ways from here with my younger sister, May." He paused. "I was in the general store, and I heard about your situation. I'm real sorry for what happened to you." Lily said nothing, just stared at him, her body tense with suspicion. She had been betrayed by one man's words already. Why should she trust another? "It's not right, you being out here alone in the cold," Heath continued, his words slow and deliberate. "My sister and I, we have a spare room. It's nothing fancy, but it's clean and it's warm. You'd be safe there. May would be there as a chaperone, so everything would be proper." He looked her directly in the eye, his gaze steady and honest. "It would be no trouble. It's the right thing to do." The offer hung in the air between them, a lifeline thrown into a stormy sea. His words were so different from the flowery promises in Robert's letter. There was no talk of love or a future, only a plain-spoken offer of a safe, warm room. It was a practical kindness, and in that moment, practicality felt more real than any dream. She looked from his earnest face to the vast, terrifying darkness around her. She had prayed for help, and here it was, standing before her in the worn boots and dusty hat of a cowboy. Slowly, hesitantly, she gave a single small nod. It was not a nod of joy or even of trust, but one of sheer, desperate necessity. It was the only choice she had. The ride to the ranch was a long, silent journey through a world painted in silver and black. Lily sat stiffly on the horse behind Heath, clutching her small suitcase. The vastness of the landscape was both terrifying and awe-inspiring. When they finally arrived, the ranch house was a welcome sight, a low, solid structure with a soft golden light glowing in the windows. The door swung open, and a young woman with a kind, worried face and a lantern in her hand rushed out. This was May. "Oh, you poor dear," she said, her voice warm and gentle. "You must be frozen straight through. Come inside quickly now." Her welcome was so genuine, so devoid of pity, that some of the icy fear around Lily's heart began to thaw. May ushered her into the house, which was simple but clean and warm. She led Lily to a small private room off the main living area. "This is for you." May said softly. You rest now. We can talk properly in the morning. Left alone, Lily finally allowed herself to breathe. The events of the day crashed down on her. The hope, the weight, the rejection, and now this strange rescue. She slipped into the bed, the weight of the quilts a comfort. As she lay in the dark, the tears came again, silent and hot. They were not just tears of despair, but also of profound relief and a confused gratitude. She had been saved, but what came next was a terrifying mystery. The next morning, Lily insisted on earning her keep. She rose early to help May with chores, quickly falling into the rhythm of the household. She learned to knead bread, churn butter, and preserve vegetables. May was endlessly patient and cheerful, filling the quiet spaces with stories about the ranch, their parents, and Heath. Heath was a quiet, steady presence. He was often gone from dawn until dusk, tending to the cattle and mending fences. When he was home, he was respectful and reserved. He never pressured her to talk about her past. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Lily began to unfurl. The constant knot of anxiety in her stomach began to loosen. One evening, after supper, May read from the family Bible. It was a passage about casting your burdens upon the Lord. Lily listened, the words seeping into her weary soul. It was through these shared moments of quiet companionship and peaceful reflection that a real friendship began to grow. Lily started to see the deep goodness in both Heath and May. She saw a man whose faith was not just something he talked about, but something he lived in every action, in every hard day's work, and in his unwavering kindness to a stranger. But the peace was fragile, a thin sheet of ice over deep, dark water. One afternoon, the town sheriff rode up to the ranch. He wasn't smiling. Heath, he said, nodding curtly. Got a question for your guest. The sheriff turned his hard eyes on Lily. Ma'am, a man in town, a freight driver, claims Robert Miller owed him a substantial sum of money. Says Miller told him his new bride would be bringing the payment with her. Lily's blood ran cold. I don't know anything about that, she stammered. Don't you? The sheriff asked, his voice laced with suspicion. Funny, Miller leaving town just as you arrive. And funny that he told folks you'd be settling his debts. Makes a man wonder if you were in on it with him. The accusation hung in the air, thick and poisonous. She wasn't just an abandoned woman anymore. She was a suspect. The sheriff's visit shattered the fragile peace of the ranch. The town that had seemed merely distant was now openly hostile. When May went to the general store for supplies, she was met with cold stares and whispered conversations that stopped the moment she drew near. The story had twisted. Lily wasn't the victim anymore. She was a potential accomplice, a grifter who'd been double-crossed by her partner. Heath defended her fiercely. She's got nothing, he told anyone who would listen. She came here with one small suitcase and a broken heart. Leave her be. But his words did little to quell the suspicion. The debt Robert left behind was real, and the freight driver was a loud and angry man. The shadow of Robert Miller loomed larger than ever. He wasn't just a memory of a broken promise. He was a phantom poisoning her new life, turning her sanctuary into a cage. Lily retreated into herself, the fear and shame returning with a vengeance. She felt like a burden on Heath and May, a source of trouble they didn't deserve. One evening, she sat alone in her small room holding Robert's letter. She read the familiar words, but now they seemed different, coded in lies. Her eyes traced the elegant script, the promises of a shared future. And then she saw it. Near the bottom of the page where he'd signed his name, the handwriting was subtly different. The loop on the R was tighter, the slant of the T more severe. It was a small thing, almost imperceptible. But it was there. Her heart pounded in her chest. She smoothed the letter out on the small bedside table, her hands trembling. She read it again, this time not for comfort, but for clues. He described the homestead, nestled by the twin oaks where the creek forks. But Heath's ranch only had one large oak tree, and the creek didn't fork for another 2 miles downstream. It was another small detail, but it was wrong. Robert Miller hadn't just lied to her. He had been careless. Or perhaps he hadn't been the only one writing the letter. A new, terrifying thought took root in her mind. This wasn't just a simple betrayal. It was a scheme, a carefully constructed trap. And she had walked right into it. That night she couldn't sleep. The image of the different handwriting burned in her mind. Who else had held this pen? Who else knew the intimate details of her hopes and dreams? She felt a chill crawl up her spine that had nothing to do with the night air. The next day, a stranger rode up to the ranch. He was a hard-looking man with cold eyes and a scar that ran from his temple to his jaw. He didn't dismount. He just sat on his horse, looking the place over. "I'm looking for Robert Miller," he said, his voice a low growl. Heath stepped onto the porch, positioning himself between the man and the door. "He's not here. Left town weeks ago." The man's cold eyes flickered toward Lily, who was standing frozen in the doorway. "Is that so?" "Well, he owes my employer a great deal of money, more than just for some freight charges. He was supposed to have it when his rich little bride arrived from the east." The man spat on the ground. "And since he ain't here and she is, I figure she knows where he is, or where the money is." Heath's hand moved almost imperceptibly toward the axe handle leaning against the porch rail. "She doesn't know anything. You need to leave. Now." The man smirked, a cruel, ugly twisting of his lips. He looked directly at Lily. "We'll be back," he said. "And next time, we won't be so polite." He wheeled his horse around and rode away, leaving a thick cloud of dust and a heavier cloud of dread hanging over the ranch. The threat was no longer just whispers and suspicion. It was real. It had a face. And it was coming back. The stranger's visit changed everything. The ranch was no longer a refuge. It was a target. That night, Heath didn't bank the fire and go to bed. He cleaned his rifle, his movements deliberate and grim. May, her face pale, locked the doors and barred the windows, something Lily had never seen her do before. The silence in the house was heavy, thick with unspoken fear. "Who was that man?" Lily whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know," Heath said, his jaw tight. "But he's not the kind of man who makes idle threats." He looked at Lily, his eyes full of a fierce protectiveness that made her heart ache. "You're not safe here anymore." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. He was right. She had brought this danger to their doorstep. Her presence was endangering the only two people in the world who had shown her kindness. "I have to leave," she said, the words tasting like ash. "In the morning I'll go." "Go where?" May asked, her voice sharp with emotion. "You have no money. No one. You'd be walking right back into the lion's den. That man would find you before you even reached the next town." "She's right," Heath said, his voice low and firm. "You're not leaving. We're in this together now." The conviction in his voice was absolute. It wasn't a question or a debate. It was a fact. They were a family, forged in crisis, and they would face this threat as one. But Lily knew they needed more than just conviction. They needed answers. The next day, while Heath rode the fence lines, keeping a watchful eye on the horizon, Lily and May turned the house upside down. They were looking for anything Robert Miller might have left behind. He had boarded with them for a few weeks before Lily arrived, charming his way into their home with stories of his planned homestead and his search for a good Christian wife. Now, his memory was a stain. They searched the small room he had used, pulling up floorboards and checking behind loose stones in the fireplace. They found nothing. It was as if he had been a ghost. Defeated, Lily sat at the kitchen table, staring at the deceptive letter. "There's something here," she insisted, tracing the different signature. "I know there is." May came and stood behind her, looking over her shoulder. "Betsy Caldwell," May said suddenly. "That's the name of the woman he left with. From Juniper Gulch." She paused, her mind working. "I remember Robert mentioning her. He said she was an old family friend helping him get settled." "What if she wasn't just a friend?" Lily asked, a cold dread creeping over her. "What if she was his partner?" They looked at each other, the same horrifying realization dawning on both of them. The different handwriting, the incorrect details about the land. It wasn't carelessness. It was a second person's input. A woman's input. Betsy Caldwell hadn't been the other woman Robert chose. She had been part of the scam from the very beginning. They were a team, preying on lonely women, luring them west with false promises, and likely taking whatever money or possessions they brought with them. The freight driver's debt, the scar-faced man's threats, it all started to make a horrible kind of sense. Robert wasn't just a heartless cad. He was a professional criminal, and Betsy was his accomplice. "We have to tell the sheriff," Lily said, standing up so fast the chair scraped against the floor. "He has to believe me now." Heath returned at dusk, his face grim. He had seen tracks on the north pasture, 2 horses. They had been watching the house. Time was running out. He agreed that going to the sheriff was their only option. The next morning, before the sun was fully up, Heath and Lily rode into Cedar Ridge. The town was quiet, the streets empty. They tied their horses in front of the sheriff's office and went inside. Sheriff Brody was sitting at his desk, drinking coffee. He looked up, his expression guarded. Lily laid the letter on his desk and explained everything. The 2 sets of handwriting, the incorrect details, the man with the scar. She told him her theory about Robert and Betsy being a team of con artists. The sheriff listened, his eyes narrowing. He picked up the letter and studied it. "It's a good story, ma'am," he said finally, his voice flat. "But it's just that. A story. I've got no proof. Just your word against a respected man's debt." "Respected?" Heath scoffed. "He's a liar and a thief." "Maybe," the sheriff conceded. "But right now, all I have is a complaint from a citizen about a debt, and a wild theory from a woman who has every reason to be angry at the man who jilted her. It's not enough to act on." Disappointment washed over Lily, cold and bitter. She had been so sure this would change everything. But it hadn't. They were still on their own. As they walked out of the office, the morning sun felt cold and mocking. Just as they reached their horses, the freight driver, a burly man named Silas, stepped out of the general store. He saw them and his face contorted with rage. "There she is!" he roared, pointing a thick finger at Lily. "The cheat's accomplice! Sheriff, are you going to do something or just let them walk all over us honest folk?" A small crowd began to gather, drawn by the shouting. The whispers started again, louder this time. Lily felt their eyes on her, 100 tiny daggers of judgment. She was trapped, branded a criminal in the court of public opinion. And she knew, with a sickening certainty, that the man with the scar would not be satisfied with public opinion. He would be coming back to the ranch to get what he wanted, and the law wasn't going to stop him. They rode back to the ranch under a cloud of failure. The town had turned against them, and the law had turned its back. They were isolated, a tiny island in a sea of suspicion and impending violence. Heath was quiet on the ride, but Lily could see the anger simmering in the set of his jaw. He wasn't just protecting a guest anymore. He was defending his own. That evening, as they sat around the table, the mood was somber. The rifle was clean and loaded, resting against the wall. Every creak of the old house made them jump. "We can't just wait for them to come," May said, her voice barely a whisper. "There has to be something we can do." "The sheriff won't help," Heath stated grimly. "We're on our own." Lily stared at the letter, which she had clutched in her hand the entire way back from town. The lies on the page seemed to mock her, nestled by the twin oaks where the creek forks. The phrase repeated in her mind. It was a lie about Heath's land. But what if it wasn't a lie? What if it was a description of a real place? Juniper Gulch, Lily said suddenly, looking up. That's where Betsy Caldwell is from. That's what Mr. Abernathy said. Heath and May looked at her, confused. What if the homestead Robert described in the letter isn't a fantasy? She continued, her thoughts racing. What if it's a real place, but it's near Juniper Gulch? What if that's their base of operations? It was a long shot, a desperate gamble based on a single line in a liar's letter, but it was the only lead they had. It's too dangerous, Heath said immediately. For you to go there? Absolutely not. I don't have to go, Lily said, her eyes meeting his. You do. The plan was risky, bordering on insane. Heath would ride to Juniper Gulch, a half-day's journey, under the pretense of looking for stray cattle. He would search for a piece of land matching the letter's description. If he found it, it might be the proof they needed, a hideout, a base for the con artists. It could be enough to force the sheriff's hand, but it would mean leaving Lily and May alone at the ranch, vulnerable and unprotected. I can't leave you both here, Heath argued, shaking his head. They could come back at any time. We'll be fine, May said, her voice surprisingly firm. She looked at the rifle against the wall. I know how to use that. Father taught us both. We'll bar the doors, and we won't let anyone in. Lily looked at the two of them, the brother and sister who had taken her in, who were now risking their lives for her. The strength in their faces gave her a courage she didn't know she possessed. You have to go, Heath, she said. It's our only chance. Reluctantly, he agreed. He left before dawn the next morning, a rifle in his saddle scabbard and a grim look on his face. Keep the doors locked, he said, his hand lingering on Lily's shoulder for a moment. I'll be back by nightfall tomorrow. The moment he rode out of sight, the ranch felt vast and empty. The silence was deafening. Lily and May went about their chores, their movements tense and their ears straining for any sound out of the ordinary. They bolted the doors and shuttered the windows, plunging the house into a gloomy twilight. Hours crawled by. The sun reached its peak and began its slow descent. Every rustle of leaves, every call of a bird sent a jolt of adrenaline through them. As evening approached, they saw a cloud of dust on the horizon. It wasn't one rider. It was two. Lily's heart leaped into her throat. They're here, she breathed. May grabbed the rifle, her knuckles white. Get away from the windows. They huddled in the center of the main room, the heavy rifle resting on the dining table, pointed at the door. They heard the horses stop outside, the jingle of harnesses, the thud of boots on the hard-packed earth. Then a heavy fist pounded on the door. We know you're in there, ladies, a familiar, gravelly voice called out. It was the man with the scar. Our business isn't with you. It's with Robert Miller. Just tell us where he put the strongbox, and we'll be on our way. The strongbox. So that's what this was about. Robert hadn't just run up debts. He had stolen something. Something valuable enough for these men to kill for. We don't know what you're talking about, May shouted, her voice shaking but loud. Robert isn't here. There was a low chuckle from outside. I don't believe you. We'll give you 1 minute to open this door. If you don't, we'll open it ourselves. Lily and May exchanged a terrified look. The heavy wooden bar across the door was sturdy, but it wouldn't hold forever against two determined men. The minute crawled by, each second stretching into an eternity. Then they heard a loud crack as an axe bit into the wood of the door. The assault had begun. Splinters flew into the room. Another crack, louder this time. The door shuddered in its frame. Lily's mind raced. They couldn't just sit here and wait for the door to break down. She looked around the dimly lit room, her eyes landing on the fireplace. A desperate idea sparked in her mind. The fireplace, she whispered to May. "The chimney." May looked at her, her eyes wide with understanding. While May kept the rifle aimed at the splintering door, Lily scrambled to the hearth. She grabbed the heavy iron poker and jammed it into the flue, pushing it open. Then she started grabbing anything that would burn: old newspapers, kindling, even a small three-legged stool. She shoved it all into the fireplace and lit it with a lucifer from the mantel. The fire caught quickly, roaring to life. But she wasn't trying to create warmth. She was trying to create smoke. Thick, choking smoke began to billow out into the room and, more importantly, up the chimney. Outside, the men coughed. "What the hell is that?" one of them yelled. The chopping stopped. Lily added more to the fire: green leaves from a decorative plant, anything that would make the smoke thicker and blacker. A moment later, they heard sputtering and cursing from outside as the thick, acrid smoke poured out of the chimney and descended around the front of the house. With another splintering crack, the door finally burst open. The man with the scar stumbled in, his eyes red and streaming from the smoke, a pistol in his hand. But as he stepped through the doorway, he was blinded by the smoke inside. May didn't hesitate. The rifle boomed, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. The man cried out and staggered back, clutching his shoulder, the pistol clattering to the floor. His partner, who had been right behind him, froze in the doorway, momentarily stunned. That was all the time Lily needed. She grabbed a cast-iron skillet from the stove and swung it with all her might, connecting with the side of the second man's head. He crumpled to the floor without a sound. The scar-faced man was on his knees, bleeding and disoriented. Before he could recover, May was on him, pressing the hot barrel of the rifle against his neck. "Don't move!" she hissed, her voice filled with a cold fury Lily had never heard before. They had done it. They had survived. But as the adrenaline faded, a new terror set in. They were two women, alone with two violent men, one of them unconscious and the other wounded and furious. And Heath was still a day's ride away. The minutes after the attack felt like hours. May held the rifle on the wounded man, while Lily used rope from the pantry to tie the hands and feet of the unconscious one. The scar-faced man, whose name they learned was Jed, glared at them with pure hatred, blood seeping through his fingers where he clutched his shoulder. "You'll regret this," he spat, "when our boss finds out what you did." "Your boss?" Lily asked, her voice shaking slightly as she tightened the knots on the other man's wrists. "You work for someone?" "Robert Miller is a dead man walking," Jed growled. "He stole from Mr. Thorne, stole his strongbox. Thorne wants it back, and he'll tear this whole county apart to find it." The name hit Lily like a physical blow. Mr. Thorne. She had heard that name back in the city. A ruthless industrialist, a man known for his brutal business practices and the dangerous men he employed to enforce his will. Robert hadn't just scammed lonely women and run up some debts. He had stolen from a monster. This was so much bigger, so much more dangerous than she could have ever imagined. The second man started to stir, groaning as consciousness returned. They had to get out. They couldn't stay here, waiting for these men to get free or for their boss to show up. "We have to go to the sheriff," Lily said urgently. "Now. We can't handle this alone." "And leave the ranch?" May asked, her eyes wide. "They could burn it to the ground." "It's better than being here when they wake up properly," Lily insisted. They dragged the unconscious man and the wounded Jed into the small root cellar, locking the heavy outer door and wedging a beam against it. It wouldn't hold them forever, but it would buy them time. They scribbled a hasty note for Heath, explaining what had happened, and left it on the kitchen table. Then they saddled the two fastest horses and rode for Cedar Ridge as if the devil himself were on their heels. The sun had set, and a full moon was rising, bathing the landscape in an eerie silver light. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat, every gust of wind sounded like pursuing hoofbeats. They pushed the horses hard, their hearts pounding in time with the frantic rhythm. They galloped into town looking like wild things, their hair flying, their faces smudged with soot. They stormed into the sheriff's office, both talking at once, the story tumbling out. The attack, the gun, the strongbox, the name Mr. Thorne. This time, the sheriff listened. The blood on Lily's sleeve and the sheer terror in their eyes were proof enough that this was no wild theory. When he heard the name Thorne, his face went pale. He knew the name. Everyone did. "All right," he said, grabbing his gun belt. "Get a couple of deputies. We'll ride out there now." But as he spoke, the door to his office was kicked open. Standing there, flanked by 2 armed men, was Robert Miller. He looked different than Lily had imagined. He wasn't handsome or charming. He was thin, with shifty eyes and the desperate air of a cornered rat. And right beside him, a cruel smirk on her face, was a woman with flinty eyes and hair the color of straw. Betsy Caldwell. "Evening, Sheriff," Betsy said, her voice smooth as poison. "We've come to report a crime. This woman," she pointed a finger at Lily, "is an accomplice to a thief. She helped my fiancé Robert hide a stolen strongbox, but he's had a change of heart. He's ready to tell you exactly where it is, in exchange for a little leniency." The sheriff was frozen, caught completely off guard. Robert wouldn't meet Lily's eyes. He was sweating, his gaze darting around the room. It was a trap. A perfect, diabolical trap. They had come back to frame her for the entire crime. Robert would lead the sheriff to the strongbox, claim Lily helped him hide it, and then he and Betsy would vanish while Lily was left to face the wrath of a man like Thorne. Her word against theirs. A stranger against a man willing to cooperate with the law. She was doomed. Meanwhile, Heath was riding hard through the night. He had found it, tucked away in a small, forgotten valley near Juniper Gulch, just as the letter described. A small, dilapidated cabin, nestled by twin oaks where a creek forked. It was deserted, but the signs of recent occupation were everywhere. A cold fire pit, fresh horse tracks, a discarded woman's glove. It was their hideout. He had the proof he needed. He was pushing his horse, Gus, to the limit, driven by a terrible premonition that he had been gone too long. As he crested the last ridge overlooking his own valley, he saw it. A faint orange glow against the night sky, coming from the direction of his ranch. It wasn't the warm, welcoming light of a lantern. It was the hungry, flickering light of a fire. "No," he whispered, digging his heels into Gus's sides, his heart hammering against his ribs. He galloped toward the light, praying he was wrong, praying it was just a trick of the moonlight. But as he got closer, the smell of smoke hit him, thick and acrid. He burst into the clearing, and his worst fears were realized. The barn was ablaze, flames leaping high into the sky, devouring the dry timber. He leaped from his horse before it had even stopped, his eyes scanning frantically for Lily and May. The house was dark. The note he would later find on the table was still unread, but he saw fresh tracks leading away from the ranch, toward town. And he saw other tracks. The men in the cellar. Jed and his partner, their prison smashed open, had clearly escaped, set the fire as a diversion or an act of revenge, and fled. He knew in his gut that Lily and May were in terrible danger. He didn't even stop to fight the fire. The barn was lost. All that mattered was them. He mounted Gus again and rode for Cedar Ridge, the fiery glow of his burning barn lighting his way, a vision of hell at his back. He arrived in town just as the standoff in the sheriff's office reached its breaking point. He saw the horses tied outside and burst through the door, his face wild with fear and rage. He took in the scene in an instant. Lily and May, pale and terrified, the sheriff, outnumbered, and Robert and Betsy, looking triumphant. "What's going on here?" Heath demanded, his voice a low growl. "Stay out of this, rancher," Betsy sneered. "This is official business." "My barn is burning," Heath said, his voice deadly quiet. His eyes locked onto Robert's. and my sister and my guest were attacked. I think that makes it my business." The sheriff, emboldened by Heath's arrival, finally found his nerve. "All right, that's enough. Everyone lower your weapons." But Robert was panicking. He knew the game was up. He grabbed Betsy's arm. "Forget this," he hissed. "Let's go." He pulled a small pistol from his coat and fired a wild shot toward the ceiling. In the chaos, he and Betsy bolted out the back door of the office. The sheriff and his deputies ran after them, shots ringing out in the night. Heath didn't follow. He rushed to Lily's side. "Are you all right?" he asked, his hands gently gripping her arms. She nodded, still trembling. "Heath, your barn." "It's just a building," he said, his eyes searching her face. "It doesn't matter." The sound of shouting and more gunshots echoed from the street. A moment later, the sheriff returned, his face grim. "They got away," he said. "Vanished into the night." The momentary relief Lily had felt evaporated. Robert and Betsy were still out there, and now they were even more desperate. But Heath had returned with more than just righteous anger. "They have a hideout," he said, turning to the sheriff. "Near Juniper Gulch. I found it. A cabin by Twin Oaks, just like in the letter." The sheriff's eyes widened. This was the proof he needed, a physical location, a place to investigate. "And Thorne's men?" he asked. "They were at the ranch," Lily explained quickly. "We trapped them in the cellar. They must have escaped and set the fire." The pieces were finally clicking into place. Robert and Betsy had orchestrated the whole thing. They stole the strongbox, set Lily up to take the fall, and used Heath's ranch as a temporary hiding place for the loot before they could make their getaway. The attack by Jed's men had just been an unforeseen complication. "We have to find that strongbox," the sheriff said. "Before Thorne's men do. If a man like that starts a war in my county, a lot of innocent people are going to get hurt." He looked at the letter in Lily's hand. "Robert claimed he knew where it was. He was going to lead us to it." Lily's mind was racing. Robert was a coward. He wouldn't hide it somewhere difficult or clever. He would hide it somewhere close, somewhere he thought was safe. Her eyes widened. "The ranch," she whispered. "It has to be at the ranch." They all rode back together, a small posse under the moonlight, the smoldering ruins of the barn casting a grim, flickering light on their faces as they arrived. They searched the house, the sheds, everywhere. Nothing. Defeated, they stood outside, the smell of wet, charred wood hanging in the air. "It's not here," the sheriff said, frustration clear in his voice. Lily looked at the smoking skeleton of the barn, her heart aching for Heath's loss. And then she remembered something May had told her. A story about their father. How he had built the place with his own 2 hands. How he always said the foundation was the most important part. She walked toward the wreckage, Heath at her side. In the center of the barn's foundation, there was a large, flat flagstone that had always seemed slightly out of place. It was cracked now from the heat, but it was intact. "Heath," she said, pointing. "Help me with this." Together, they managed to pry the heavy stone up. And there, nestled in a shallow depression in the earth, was a small, iron-banded strongbox. It was a moment of triumph, but it was short-lived. A voice cut through the night, cold and sharp. "I'll be taking that." They turned. Standing at the edge of the clearing, holding a rifle, was Betsy Caldwell, and behind her, looking more pathetic than ever, was Robert. They hadn't fled. They had circled back, waiting for the perfect moment to reclaim their prize. "It's over, Betsy," the sheriff said, his hand moving slowly toward his pistol. "Drop the rifle." Betsy just laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "I don't think so. We'll take the box, and you'll all stand right there and watch us go. Anyone makes a move, the rancher gets a bullet." She leveled the rifle directly at Heath's chest. Heath didn't flinch. He stood his ground in front of Lily, shielding her with his body. The world seemed to shrink to the small space between them, the smoking ruins of the barn and the two desperate criminals at the edge of the woods. The air was thick with tension, a single spark away from exploding into violence. Lily looked at Robert. His face was a mask of fear and indecision. The pistol in his hand was shaking. He was the weak link. "Why, Robert?" Lily asked, her voice clear and steady, cutting through the tension. "Why did you do all this?" He flinched at the sound of her voice, refusing to meet her eyes. "He didn't do anything," Betsy snapped. "This was my plan. He's just along for the ride." "Is that true, Robert?" Lily pressed, her gaze locked on him. "Are you just her puppet? I came all this way because I believed your words. I believed you were a good, honest man. Was any of it real?" "Shut up!" Betsy shrieked, her finger tightening on the trigger.
"It was all lies," Robert mumbled, finally looking at her, his eyes filled with a miserable self-loathing. "All of it." "No," a new voice said, firm and cold. It came from the shadows behind Robert and Betsy. A tall, impeccably dressed man stepped into the moonlight, flanked by two more men, including a now bandaged Jed. He was older, with silver hair and eyes as cold and hard as chips of ice. Mr. Thorne had arrived. "Not all of it was a lie," Thorne said, his voice calm and terrifying. "The part about you stealing my property, Mr. Miller? That was very real." Betsy and Robert froze, their escape plan crumbling into dust. They were trapped between the law on one side and a man far more dangerous on the other. Betsy, realizing her position was hopeless, made a desperate move. She swung the rifle toward Thorne and fired. But Thorne's men were faster. Two shots rang out almost simultaneously. Betsy crumpled to the ground. Robert screamed, dropping his pistol and falling to his knees, his hands in the air. It was over in a matter of seconds. Thorne's men collected the strongbox, their movements efficient and professional. Thorne gave a curt nod to the sheriff, a silent acknowledgement between two men of power. "My business here is concluded, Sheriff," he said. Then he looked at Lily and Heath, his cold eyes lingering on them for a moment. "You have my thanks," he said, the words sounding strange coming from him, "for recovering my property." And with that, he and his men melted back into the night, leaving the sheriff to deal with the aftermath. Robert was taken into custody, weeping and babbling, his life of crime ending not with a bang, but with a pathetic whimper. Justice, in its own brutal and swift way, had been served. As the sun began to rise, painting the eastern sky with soft shades of pink and gold, the small group stood in the ashes of the old barn. The immediate danger was gone, but the ranch was scarred, and their lives were forever changed. May was tending to a small burn on her arm, the sheriff was making notes, and Lily and Heath stood together, looking at the foundation where the strongbox had been. "I'm sorry, Heath," Lily said softly, gesturing to the ruins. "All of this, it's my fault." He turned to her, his face smudged with soot, his eyes full of a deep, unwavering emotion. He took her hand, his calloused fingers wrapping around hers. "None of this is your fault, Lily," he said, his voice firm. "You were the victim, and you were braver than anyone I've ever known." He looked out over the land. His land, the rolling hills now bathed in the gentle light of dawn. "This is just wood and nails. We can rebuild it. We can rebuild it stronger." He turned back to her, his gaze intense. "That first night at the station, I offered you a safe place. But you've done more than just stay here. You've defended this home. You've made it yours." He took a deep breath. "I know our beginning was born from hardship and fear. But my feelings for you are as real and as solid as this ground we're standing on. I've come to love you, Lily." To her astonishment, he went down on one knee, right there in the ashes. He looked up at her, his heart shining in his eyes. "Would you do me the honor of being my wife? Would you help me rebuild this ranch, not just as a guest, but as its heart?" Tears of pure, untainted joy welled in Lily's eyes. This was no fairy tale proposal. It was something real, forged in fire and faith. It was a promise of a shared future, built on a foundation of truth and courage. "Yes," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "Yes, Heath, I will marry you." He stood and pulled her into his arms, and in that embrace, surrounded by the ruins of the past, they found their beautiful beginning. The wedding was a simple affair, held in the meadow overlooking the valley. The whole town of Cedar Ridge turned out, their suspicion replaced by a deep respect for the woman who had faced down criminals and protected one of their own. Life on the ranch was a rhythm of hard work and deep contentment. They rebuilt the barn together, bigger and stronger than before. Their love, born from crisis, deepened into a partnership that could withstand any storm. A year later, as they sat on the porch of their home, watching the sunset paint the sky, Lily held their newborn son Jonah in her arms. Heath's arm was wrapped around her, his hand resting gently on the baby's head. The journey that had begun in the cold darkness of a deserted train station had led them here, to this moment of perfect, profound peace. They had faced down lies and violence and had built a life on a foundation of faith, courage, and a love that was stronger than any fire. They had their forever after, not as a fairy tale, but as something better. A real, enduring love, blessed by faith and sealed with the promise of new life. We hope you were moved by Lily and Heath's journey of faith, love, and second chances. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more tales of hope, redemption, and forever afters, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue to share these heartfelt stories.